as a statistician, which is what I am, the first thing is definitions. You can't write about sex. Well, what is sex? And you think, what is sex? We know what sex is. No, we don't know what sex is, and there's no agreement about what sex is. And this became of sort of constitutional importance in the States, where many of the older ones of you remember this business. That's Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton, 1997, best of chums. Well, a year later, they weren't the best of chums, because Bill Clinton was saying on oath that he didn't have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. And it turned out that she had given him oral sex in the Oval Room. So and he was impeached by the Senate, US Senate. And the impeachment actually rested very largely on whether they considered that oral sex counted as sexual relations or not. Was oral sex sex? And the future of the presidency of the United States depended on this ludicrous, or actually I'd think, rather important for what we could talk about, judgment. And at that time, the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association rushed through a paper which was a survey of 600 US students had been done who were asked about whether this level of intimacy counts as having sex. And I won't read all those out, you can read those yourself. And the blue is the percentage of men, and the red is the percentage of women that considered that as having sex. So this stuff up here, not many people considered that having sex. Penile vaginal intercourse, people did consider sex. Actually, not 100% of men consider that as having sex. You wonder, you wonder what they're waiting for before they feel they've gone all the way, got to number 10. Anyway, they're clearly doomed to disappointment. But the interesting thing is here that less than half, particularly among the women, thought that oral sex counted as sex. And so, actually, this is US students, of course. Most of these surveys are done on psychology students or students. So whether we can believe that is representative. The curious fact was that when the Senate voted on Clinton's impeachment in 1999, the vote went almost exactly the same as this. 45 said he was guilty of perjury, in other words, oral sex was sex, and 55 said he was not guilty, in other words, oral sex was not sex. Now, actually, this is really voting on party lines, so it's pretty coincidental, perhaps. But it does show that, just what is sex is controversial and contested. Now, from now on, everything from there downwards is going to count as sex, because that is the official definition for the large national sex surveys I'm going to be talking about. And that definition, the oral, vaginal, penile, anal, all that stuff, counts as sex, really grew out of the 1980s when these big surveys were commissioned in the sort of throes of the fear of AIDS. And really sex was then defined as almost anything that could transfer disease. So that's what sex became known as. So that's now the official definition of sex. So a sexual partner counts as someone which you've done that stuff with. Okay, so remember that. Now, what's going on with something went strangely wrong with my clicker there. Anyway, now one of the things I do in the book, and this is to reflect the fact that if you Google sex statistics, I'm not suggesting you do it. There's all sorts of things I'm going to say, and I don't want an answer, and I don't suggest you do it. But if you did Google sex statistics, you find all sorts of drivel coming up. It's an area full up with rubbish statistics. So one of the issues that I wanted to take on this was to try to distinguish between stats I could sort of believe, which I call 4-star stats, good official statistics, and I'll come to some of those that do relate to tell us something about sexual behaviour, right down to 0-star, with essentially just made up numbers, and we get some of those, with everything in between. And this is what I'm going to go through, and this is a judgment, of course. The first thing is that in statistics, we teach about confidence intervals and things like that. That's almost irrelevant in this context, because big sample sizes does not guarantee good statistics. Some of the worst statistics I'm going to talk about are based on big sample sizes. So that is nothing to do with sample sizes. So therefore, our usual way in which we judge the accuracy of stats, we have to ditch. We can't judge it by sample size. We have to use our judgment much more about, was this a good representative sample? Can we trust the answers, and so on. So it's much more to do with the quality of the survey, etc. And I'm just going to count 3 stars as good surveys, where I reckon it's about I reckon as a judgment, the numbers, I believe them up to about plus or minus 20%. 2-star ones where, well, 20%, it could be anything up to, between 20% and it could be half, it could be double, really, very rough ballpark. 1-star it could be almost anything. And 0-star, they just made them up. Men, think of sex every 7 seconds, that sort of drivel. Okay, so we won't do it. Okay, so 4-star stats, some 4-star stats from official statistics, which reflect sexual behavior. They don't directly measure sexual behavior because that's very difficult. We can't put a camera on people's heads. That might influence what they do, apart from being possibly illegal. So we can't do that sort of stuff. So we have to always infer. So one way to infer is from these official statistics. 48% of births in 2012 were formerly illegitimate, born outside marriage. So sex is occurring now outside marriage. Half of all births, essentially, in this country are born outside marriage. In 1973, 1 in 20 16-year-olds got pregnant. It's about half that now, but 1973 will crop up a lot. Anyone who was around in the early 70s may remember, if they can remember that far or anything, what was going on. Remember, it was we would see it's a particularly sort of sexually, what we might call unsalubrious time, I think, is how one might describe it. It was the time when there's highest levels of teenage pregnancy, highest levels of sexually transmitted diseases, lowest age at first birth, lowest age at first marriage, and so on. It was a time when essentially sort of sexual behavior had been liberated, but common sense and good availability of contraception had not yet been established. So it was a disastrous time, essentially, in the sexual revolution. But then, for every 20 girls born, 21 boys are born. We'll come on to that later and see, does that have a connection with sexual behavior? And this is the one I quite like, is what's known as prenuptial pregnancy. What proportion of brides were pregnant when they got married? Now that does tell us quite a lot about sexual behavior, and it's actually something we can find from official statistics by correlating marriage records with birth records and looking whether the gap is 8 months or less, essentially. Did they give birth more than 8 months? And it turns out in 1938, for example, at least half of brides under 20 were pregnant when they got married. 1 in 6 of all brides were pregnant when they got married, or had a baby at least within 8 months, so actually the proportion would be more than that. But at least half brides under 20. Sexual intercourse was not invented in 1963, no matter what Philip Larkin might say. So it was lovely though when the Registrar General worked out those stats. He wrote these wonderfully pompous statements about it. So those are good statistics. And my favourite 4-star stats, this is one, we'll come back to this. I love this one. I don't think anyone's plotted this before. Every year when the Office of National Statistics release birth data, they always record the number of boys and the number of girls back to the start of civil registrations in 1837. And they give those numbers. And if you plot the ratio, the number of boys for every 100 girls, you find this fantastically impressive pattern. And this is not random variation. The variation is not large, but because this is based on 500,000 births a year, then it's enough to make sure these are real signals. So when are most boys born? What's going on when most boys are born? Sorry, at the end of wars. More boys are born at the end of wars. It's a well-known fact. It's been true in the States. It's true in other countries. More boys are born at the end, and in 1973. But we'll come back to 1973 later, because, well, I've already warned you about 1973. That was the peak of particular sort of sexual activity. Okay, so we'll come back later and I'll try to have an explanation of why more boys are born at the end of wars. Okay, here's another good 4-star statistic. How good is this number? The 7-year itch is 4 stars. If you go onto ONS data and plot what's known as, can you see that? It's green, it's not very good. What's known as the hazard curve, this is the proportion for marriages that have lasted so long, what % actually divorce in that year following marriage? And it's what we'd, in statistics, if this was a survival curve, we'd call this the hazard curve. And what happens, of course, is not that many marriages fail in the, a few celebrities down here maybe who last for 6 months and then that's it. But not that many. And then it goes up and up and up. And the peak, 7 years. 7 years is when the peak risk time of marriage is. And then it drops. It just goes on and on as we all get used to each other and learn to live with each other's foibles and so on. So not that many. If you've been married for 40 years, Still, well, what's that, 2%? 1 in 50 marriages that have lasted for 40 years, people get divorced. So it still goes on. It doesn't drop to nothing at all. Long tail to this distribution. But the peak is at 7 years. Now, of course, that's since marriage, and people will live together for, on average, I think about 3 years now, is it? Before marriage? At least 3 years before marriage. And the average age at first birth now is less than the average age at first marriage. They crossed about 10 years ago. Always, average age at first birth used to be 18 months, 2 years after the average age of first marriage. Two lines went along like that all through history, and then whoop, they crossed. Now people get, on average have babies before they get married. Okay, so that's a real 4-star statistic. 3-star. Now 3-star I would take as really good surveys. Now the Natsal survey, which some people in the audience know a lot about, probably much more than I do, Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles in Britain survey, is what I consider a good survey. Cost £7 million, the last wave. It was done in the last survey, because it's not a longitudinal survey. It's not the same people get surveyed each time. A new group of 15 or so thousand people were done in 1990, 2000 and 2010, roughly. So every 10 years. It started in 1990. It's the one, I don't know if any of you remember, that Margaret Thatcher banned, or pulled the plug on, stopped the funding for, and the Wellcome stepped in to pay for it. Margaret Thatcher said, we're not going to pay for this stuff, to pry about people's lives. And it was desperately necessary then, because people had no idea. The AIDS epidemic, people knew that it was being transferred through men who had sex with men, through unprotected sex and so on, and nobody knew what was going on. How many people were changing partners, how many concurrent partners, etc., etc. So they desperately needed to know what sexual behaviour was going on. And so the overall response rate now is 66% of those contacted. And you may think, well, that's not great, but actually for a survey, quite a long face-to-face survey, that's actually rather good. Computer-assisted self-interview, in other words, that the person being interviewed is given the computer and answers the question onto the computer, and the interviewer cannot see the responses. And it's locked down. Interviewer has no vision of the responses whatsoever. And they're paid, I think, 30 quid. And the idea also is that there's not a great relationship formed, but the person talks to the interviewer, and the interviewer, part of the ethos of it is to communicate the fact that this is beneficial to society. This is generous for someone to tell you about this, because it enables you to plan sexual health services and know what's going on. I talked about this once, and one of the interviewers happened to be in the audience, and she said it's the best survey she'd ever worked on, and she said, I believe the answers as reliable answers. Because they're not perfect, it's not 4-star. So this is the kind of stuff that they come up with. Median age at female first sex, 19 for those born around 1940, 16 for those born around 1980. So a 3-year drop in age of first sex. I won't do this now, but a much older time at first birth, which is a much longer period the need for effective contraception. This is always the one that gets a lot of attention. Median 4-week frequency of sex for sexually active 16 to 44s. That's one with a partner, from 5 times every 4 weeks in 1990 to 3 times in 2010. That's the median. It's a reduction in the frequency of sex among younger couples. 1 in 5 16 to 24-year-old women reported a sexual experience with another woman, greatly increased from 1990. We'll come back to that in a moment. These are some of the sort of headline stuff that the survey reveals. Very interesting changes in behaviour that we'll come on to more detail in a moment. If anyone's got any questions, want to stop at any time, just put your hand up and ask questions, because there's a lot of stuff here.
How does the sample draw?
It's a random sample, probability sample, and then a random person chosen from each household in the age range 16 to 75. I think it's 75, 74, yeah, 1674. So done like that, yeah.
Where is that sample taken from?
Well, it's a probability sample for the whole country. There's some stratification done in the way it's done.
So they're selecting a postcode, a household,
yeah,
and then selecting an individual.
For a random individual from the household, yes, yeah, exactly. Okay, so this is the one that got a lot of attention. median for the reduction and why. Why? Well, you know, the surveys, statisticians don't say why. And in fact, that's the coverage. When the surveys came out, the big surveys came out, almost everything focused on this statistic, the reduction in sex, and that was the picture that went with Britain having sex less often, the iPad, the curse of the iPad. And that's because one of the researchers, the investigators did mention the term iPad in an interview. And that's what got, not tonight, darling, I'm playing Angry Birds. So, or watching, you know, a box set or, you know, whatever. Anyway, so that's what got in. Now, and actually the researchers now, people like Kath Mercer, in a lovely TED talk she talks about this quite a lot, and she does conclude actually that, you know, as far as they can see, the large responsibility for this is our greater connectivity to the world. You know, the fact that we retain this connectivity all through the evening, into right through to going to bed, that we are, you know, we're looking at our emails, we're doing this, that, and the other. We just don't have that sort of quiet separation from the rest of the world as we used to. More TV channels, etc., etc. So anyway, whatever it has as reduction. So this is the kind of thing. This is the current situation by age group. So if you want to, and I'm not suggesting you necessarily do, you can look at your age, you can look up there and see this is the top in terms of frequency of sex in the last 4 weeks. Then, you know, that's the top 25%, the median here, bottom 25% there. So that's the median. And we see a steady reduction in age. What we do see also is that even for young people, it's not as if everyone's, you know, actually going at it hammer and tongs night after night. You know, actually, you know, this is not a huge amount going on in terms of perhaps our popular image of young people or whatever, or even older people. You show a decline with age. It's well known, decline of sexual activity with age. It's a mixture of ill health, of age. Yeah, sorry.
I'm confused. Why does the blue line go up 15 to 25, but the red line go down 15 to 25?
Oh, up there.
Yeah.
The medians.
The lad's doing it by himself.
No, this could be because these could have older partners.
Oh, I see. Right.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the age mixing makes things quite complicated, of course, that people will tend to have older male partners. So that group could be with that group more. Okay, so, yeah, where was I? Where was I? Oh, yes. No, but of course, one of the strongest determinants of reduction in sexual frequency is length of partnership. It tends to halve after 2 years on average together. So, and of course, they're all confounded. You know, with aging, you've got ill health, age, and length of partnership. They're all confounded. Actually trying to separate them out is quite tricky. You've got to look for older people who've started new partnerships. Not that many of them. Okay, so now, one of the issues that comes up again and again is when you ask people, as they do in this, how many sexual partners have you had? Okay, now, this is the mathematical fact that in a closed population, equal men and women, the average number of sexual partners should match. So this is the mathematical fact. You've got you've got women and you've got men, and let's pretend they're just dancing together or something like that. So, but there's these sets of partnerships. She's got a lot of partnerships. She hasn't got any. So this is their number of partnerships. Now the medians can vary. The median here is 1. The median there is 2. And the medians can be different, but the means must be the same because essentially it's the total number of partnerships, which involves both a man and a woman. Sorry, this is opposite sex partnerships. Come on to same sex in a minute. So the mean is 2 for both men and women. So that's a mathematical fact. The average, in terms of the mean average, should be the same for men and women. Actually, it's not. I mean, it never is in a survey. Any survey where you ask men how many sexual partners you've had, you ask women how many sexual partners they've had, men always report having had more sexual partners. So 16 to 44-year-olds in Natsal, it was double there. The gap's halved a bit here, but still, on average, in the latest survey, men said they had 12, women said they had 8. Okay, now, there's all sorts of reasons for it in terms of age mixing as well. That it can provide some opportunity, some reason for it. People have come up endless arguments about this, about why this might be the case. You know, some Americans suggest that, this is because of these men, all this excess is prostitutes. When they've been travelling or at home, prostitution. And you're not getting the prostitutes in this, or the sex workers in this sample. And, but, you know, I think that's I don't think it holds for here, and the Natsal researchers don't think that holds for here. So there's all sorts of reasons. Now, I think if you look at the raw data, and this is very nice, this is from Natsal. In the book, I tend to use all public data, except they did give me some raw data, which is just so lovely, just couldn't resist plotting it. You could give an entire course, I think, on this graph alone. This is the reported number of lifetime opposite-sex partners for men and women in this age group, 35 to 44. Okay, so what do we see on that picture? Now, first of all, I should say, okay, so there's loads of stuff there. Anybody observe something in that picture? What stands out to people on that graph?
Rounded to 5.
Sorry?
Rounded to 5.
Rounded numbers. Now look, down here, people are counting. Oh yes, round here, they're starting to get a bit vague, maybe. By here, they're sort of, I don't know, they're just guessing. And it's getting very rounded out. And I must say, I did cut the graph off here because it goes out. It goes out. I'd be out on the lawn otherwise, or I'd have to put it on a log scale. No, there are some very high numbers here, which of course affect the mean a lot because they drag the mean out hugely. That's why the mean is so susceptible to these very large numbers, which are clearly based on vague guesses. Apart from him who said 47. He's either fibbing or he's got extraordinarily sort of retentive memory on that stuff. But so a lot of rounding going on, and there's a suggestion that maybe men round up and women round down, because the mean is influenced by these big numbers, not by this. The means, and if men tend to round up, women tend to round down. Partly because there's a suggestion that many women might have had relationships they'd rather forget, and which they just don't want to consider as sexual partners. So that I think that's actually quite plausible. That's just sort of almost when you're just guessing, which is what these people up above here they're essentially doing. That you're being influenced by your willingness to remember. For me, that's the most convincing argument. Then, interestingly, the most common thing is 1. Very nice, isn't it? 1. There's still only about 1 in 6 who say one partner, but it is the most common. And it's I think a very important graph. You've got to look at if you look at the raw data, suddenly all sorts of explanations start coming to mind. Now, the other thing is that, which I do talk about quite a lot in the book, is experiments that people have done to try to reveal some of the psychology. And so this is one experiment they did. It's called Bogus. Do you know about bogus pipeline experiments? Bogus pipeline experiments is when you wire somebody up to a lie detector, but it's fake. It's not a real lie, but it's got sort of stuff, electrodes and things. It's got wiggly pens and all this nonsense. Complete drivel. It's not doing anything at all. Apparently this is ethical. Anyway, so they wire people up, and what they did was randomize people into 3 groups. First group were doing a confidential sex survey. The other were filling in their sex survey knowing that one of their other students was just going to come in and pick it up and carry it out. And another group did it when they were wired up to this fake lie detector. And it was randomized. And 96 men, so about 100 women, 100 men, randomized to 3 different modes: anonymous, exposure threat, and bogus pipeline. And what you see, for men, it didn't make that much difference about how many sexual partners they said they'd had on average, 4. For women, the ones who were threatened with exposure gave a lower number, and then this is anonymous, and if they were wired up to the pipeline, they said, whoa, I've had 4.4. So these are randomized, so that is a real effect. It's just significant, and so you get a match between the men and the women when they're wired up to the lie detector. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that these people are deliberately lying, but maybe that people are making a bit more effort to remember, really going through it rather than just sort of casually writing something down. But there is a suggestion there that social desirability bias is occurring. So I think this mixture of survey and psychology is very important. And of course, the other thing is, throughout all of this, it goes without saying that the qualitative work that goes along with these surveys, the actual interview work, the focus group work, is incredibly important and to reveal the reasons for things. Okay, same-sex experience. This is one of the big findings of the Natsal survey over time. Is asking for men and women 16 to 44 about whether they've had any same-sex experience. That could be just sort of kissing or something. Same-sex experience with genital contact and same-sex partner in the last 5 years. Okay, and for men it hasn't really changed very much. And actually any rise in these numbers between 1990 and 2000 tends to be, they think might be ascribed to actually reporting, more increased willingness to report. Remember 1990 was just at the, when the fear of AIDS was very high indeed. And there's, I think there's some underreporting here, same for the women. But since 2000, for younger women, it's got a very substantial same-sex experience being reported among younger women. And that's, backs up to, anecdotally what people hear. What's interesting is that if you actually ask people, as an official statistic is people's self-proclaimed sexual identity. It's part of the ONS surveys now, General Household Survey, is to ask people, about their sexual identity, including whether they're lesbian or bisexual, gay or bisexual. When you do that, I think the total for men and women comes in about 2.5%, about 1 in 40. Actually self-proclaimed, tick the box, saying, I identify myself as being gay or bisexual, or lesbian or bisexual. Now, which is, really small compared with the amount of men and women who have same-sex experience. And it just shows the danger and difficulty and the need for precision about what one means. You can't just say what proportion of the population is gay or whatever. It's just a meaningless question unless you really separate self-professed identity with behaviour and attraction as well, which sort of lies somewhere in between. So it makes it very clear that that you need to distinguish these things very clearly. Now, Kinsey. People know about Kinsey. It's extraordinary. Have you seen the film? I thought it was rather good with Liam Neeson. I thought it was rather good. He was an extraordinary man. He collected 15,000 sex histories in the 1940s. Now, his interviewing style was, and then published these books, which were bestsellers at the time. His interviewing style was the complete opposite to what's done now. He would take people out and buy them drinks, offer them a cigarette. He'd go into gay bars and talk to people, and he'd sit people down, give them a cigarette and chat to them in the vernacular, asking them all these questions. Meanwhile, noting down, there was no form, no questions written down, no coding scheme written down. The coding scheme wasn't written down for years. And that's what a completed form looked like, in this sort of secret code that only 4 people were trained to understand. It was then put onto punch cards. But this was, and you just have a conversation, just fill up bits all over the place. It took ages to learn how to fill up one of these questionnaires. And he collected thousands of these sex histories. He was he was a biologist, and he was obsessed with orgasms. Everything he did was outlets. He's got outlets. How many frequency of total outlet in relation to age for men? So this is how many outlets different age groups have in per week, mean and median. And outlets could be any sort of outlets, by yourself or homosexual. He said 37%, 1 in 3 men had homosexual outlets. That's sex to orgasm. 17% men brought up on farms had outlets with animals. So you can imagine, this is 1940s he published this stuff. It was extraordinary. And actually, I got the book of his tables that he didn't publish, and I won't go into them, but they really do. Some of those are in the book, which are completely hilarious. But never mind. But the point is that his figures are generally taken with a huge pinch of salt now, because most of his working class subjects were recruited in prisons, because he thought that was representative. He didn't believe in representative samples. He was completely against any of that idea. So he would go into a prison or into a university residence and try to interview everybody. That was how he did things. And he also had this denial form of questioning. So for that, he would ask, when did you last have sex with an animal? Or not even using those words, he'd use a vernacular term for it. So when did you last have sex with someone other than your wife? He'd ask somebody immediately. So there was active denial was required for every single activity. Through doing that, he got amazing sort of revelations that he published and made him infamous. But I'd consider these 2 stars. He has given lots of the Kinsey scale for sexual orientation, things like that. He's had lots of good influences, but in terms of his numbers, they're not great. 2 stars at best. And then you go back to the 1-star stuff. The large, the write-in surveys, the the inserts in magazines used to be, all this sort of stuff, the timeout service. Do you want to fill in our sex questionnaire? So, here's the stats, and they're absolutely filthy. Saucy statistics. Saucy statistics. Oh, God. and I've since I did this book, I've been contacted by newspapers. Oh, we're running this sex survey. We'd really like your stuff. And I just say, it's drivel. I'm not going to have anything to do with it at all. Just non-saucy statistics. I'm a serious statistician. I don't do source. So sample size is big. So 10,000 people, the sample consists of those who chose to fill out our sex survey online. So, we don't believe it. I mean, the point is it may not even be representative of the people who fill out the sex survey, because you don't know whether to believe these figures or not, what they say. They're just filling these things online. So you don't even know if it represents what the respondents are doing. And the classic example of this bad use of statistics is Shere Hite in the 1970s. People know about Shere Hite? Older people will, yeah, not. She was enormously influential in the sort of sexual revolution, and the second wave of feminism in the 1970s. And and her books, they're thick, great tomes. They contain vast amounts of personal narrative by people who sent in their experiences, and it's excellent. And her conclusions are very good. I think all about her conclusions all about women finding their sexual relationships unsatisfying, the men being being mechanical, etc., etc. So it's excellent. But her statistics are terrible, absolutely terrible. 4,000 women speak frankly. Yeah, but she sent out 100,000 questionnaires. So, okay, so there's great, the 4,000, she makes this book that thick out of, they're wonderful stories, but they're stories. But she made the mistake of then claiming that her statistics were representative. And she got absolutely hammered by the media for this. So she said 84% of women were emotionally unsatisfied with their relationships, 95% reported forms of emotional psychological harassment, 70% of women married for more than 5 years were having affairs, which, I mean, these figures are probably, there's probably quite substantial numbers in each of these categories, but, they didn't fit in with any other data surveys that were being done. And but they got a lot of coverage, of course. Now, we can actually do some nice little forensic statistics on this final figure, the 70% of women married. But if we go to the back of her book, okay, so that was her claim, and she stuck by it. If we go to the back of her book, page 856, can you believe it, of small print, you find out, I don't know if you can read it, but it says that's 70%, how it breaks down in different groups. So in different income groups, the rates are 71, 72, 68, 69, 70. In different ethnicities, the rates are 70, 71, 70, 69, 70, 70. So nothing outside 68 to 71. This is completely implausible. Some of these groups are very small, Middle Eastern women. These are small, and there's no variability essentially at all. So I just don't believe it. The stats are too good to be true. The fit is too good. So this is completely implausible. So as soon as you see that, you say, oh, she made them up. I think I can say that now without her suing me. She was always trying to sue people. Numbers are too good to be true. So we don't believe them. 1 star at best. Okay. Oh, do you know about Clelia Moshe? Oh, Clelia Moshe. Google Clelia Moshe. She's wonderful. I did write about her because she was this heroine. Isn't she great? She was this, she's a Stanford professor campaigning for the health of women. But in the First World War, she went to France as a part of the Red Cross. That's in her uniform. And she interviewed 45 women about their sex lives and attitudes in the late 1890s. And she never published the results. She felt she couldn't interview. She buried them in in her papers in the Stanford University Library. And they were discovered in 1973 by a historian 23 years after she died. And they transcribed them. You can get the book of the transcriptions. And the historian says it's a discovery of his lifetime. It's a wonderful story of how he discovered her story. And she, for example, this is one of her interviews in 1892 from a 25-year-old woman born in 1867 who talks about her, habit of intercourse, average number of times per week, 2 or 3 times a month. She's having it most twice a month. And do you desire? How often? She says, how many times do you desire for intercourse? Yes, once or twice a month. There's lots of times, lots of stuff about people's women's desire, their capacity to have orgasms and so on, all in the 1890s. Now it reflects, university wives at Stanford, so people have said this isn't at all representative of what's going on in the 1890s. but it's one of the few sources of information we have about sexual behaviour in that period, because it's, you know, you get diaries, but people don't have this level of intimacy in their diaries on the whole. Apart from Samuel Pepys, but we don't want to, that is another extraordinary. Generally, there's silence. There's a few diaries trying to find out what's going on. So we're left with trying to infer behaviour rather unsatisfactorily from births and marriages from what records there are. Now, and the group that have done this, I think, I love you, the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure. So this is trying to look back in history before good records and try to work out what behaviour was going on. So they have sent volunteers into parishes, 404 parishes, transcribing the parish registers, and then putting them to 26 parishes chosen for family reconstitution, where you're trying to match records across marriages and births. And at this point, you can start looking at how many people were giving birth 8 months after they got married, within 8 months they got married. And you can start doing things like looking at prenuptial pregnancy rates back to 1580. So you've got parish records of 1580. This is, so in 1580, 30% of brides were pregnant when they got married, at least. At least they gave birth within 9 months or 8 months of marriage. So, so these are quite high figures. You see through history up to 40% by the start of the Victorian period. The long 17th, 18th centuries went up there. A dip when Cromwell was around, but that might have just been, you know, registration or something like that, people hiding it. So you're seeing these high figures of people being pregnant when they got married. Now, many of these, it's suggested, were people who were betrothed. And they'd sort of jumped the gun because there was this recognition once a couple were betrothed that, yeah, they could go off, they could start sleeping together. And if they got pregnant, well, that's when the marriage occurred. Now, the point about those is that those will only be 1 or 2 months pregnant when they get married. And it looks like that's about 10% of all couples got married, were betrothed and got married soon after they got pregnant. But throughout this period, a large percentage were more 3+ months pregnant when they got married. So we can separate this out. These seem to be different groups of people, very constant rate. 10% of people, you know, essentially just having sex before they got married. Now, of course, you know, there may have been some people, this is not just the proportion of people having sex before marriage, because you know, there'll be more. This is just a lower limit on the proportion of people having sex before marriage. But what it shows is that sex before marriage is not an invention of the 1960s. From 1950s onwards, then this is the proportion of brides pregnant when they got married. Again, the peak, well, actually the peak is not slightly before 1970s. Peak was about 1965, up to about 25%. And they dropped down to this level. They stopped collecting these statistics at this point because it just stopped being interesting, because people weren't bothering to get married. So this stopped being any sort of statistic reflecting social behaviour. This is not interesting anymore. But it did around here. You can see this peak around here. Okay, so prenuptial pregnancies can give a nice idea. And these are 4-star statistics, so we know these are good stats. Yeah. Okay, and under 20, we see again, remember it was 50% in 1938 of under 20 marriages were pregnant when they got married. It's 40% in the late 1960s. So again, that was a period when doctors were still unwilling to give teenagers contraception without their parents' consent. And what happens? They got pregnant and had to get married. So how am I getting on? Oh yeah, well, I'll stop soon. Yeah, so just to finish off, historic, and going back to a bit more history. This is civil registrations. Again, as a statistician, I kind of like the official data. What can we learn from official data? And this is great. This is an early infographic. It was a bastardy map for England and Wales. 1842. You think that, you know, maps and infographics, you think these things are modern inventions. No, 1842, they're doing a bastardy map. And top of the league table was Norfolk, which is that gets a much bigger laugh in East Anglia than it does here. But anyone who knows stories about Norfolk will recognise the joke there. Okay, let's get back to some official statistics here. This was the total fertility rate between the 1870 for the start of official records. So this was, total fertility rate is the number of babies you'd expect a woman to have if throughout her lifetime she experienced the fertility that was present at the moment. So it's not actually the number of babies a woman will have It's her, it's a sort of imaginary person living through their life at the moment. And what we see there is a reduction from essentially natural fertility throughout most of the Victorian period, and there's massive fertility. The fertility transition, staggering change between 1870s and the early 1900s, from 5 to 2, essentially back down to replacement. It shot up again for fertility after the Second World War, whatever, 1960s, of course, and then down again to here. So, and historians have argued for a long time what caused this drop in fertility. What was it? How did the Victorians stop having babies? Late Victorians stop having babies. Big argument still going on, really argument among historians, because idea is that not that much abortion around that much, and very little artificial contraception around. So, what was it? Was it withdrawal or what? What were people actually doing? And very little data. And people say that Moshe's data is not representative because that's American middle class women. So what was going on? And I got a theory. Which I'd like to reflect. And the theory is connected back to the sex ratio statistic. Okay, that was the picture I showed before with those dates. 1919 was extraordinary. 1919, there are more babies born in 1919 than any year in the whole history of this country. The absolute numbers, not rate, just the 900,000 kids were born in 1919, more than any other year in history in this country. And a relatively bigger proportion were boys than usual. Why are more boys born at the end of wars? Same in America. Peak of boys being born after the Second World War. Another peak, 1973. So why is that going on? So this is from from official American data. What's happening to the sex ratio here? What's going on? Why are people having more babies? Okay, I'm a big follower of this guy, Bill James, who's a lovely man, retired professor from UCL. And he says there's more boys if there's a higher coital rate. Now, I shouldn't, I'm trying not to make stupid jokes, but that doesn't mean how fast you do it. It means how many times you do it. So a higher coital rate means there's a lot of unprotected sex going on every day, twice a day, whatever. And as I'll argue in a minute, this leads to conceptions earlier on in the cycle. And that's true. That is just mathematically true. And conception not at the time of peak fecundity. So that is true. So if you have more sex going on, which I'll explain in a moment, you tend to get conception not at the time of peak fecundity. Now, okay. Now, what's the reason for that? And this is a fascinating graph as well. It's extraordinary. This is the chance, estimated chance from the biggest study that's been done on 700 couples using natural contraception or whatever, on the chance of getting pregnant from having sex just once. So this is the chance of getting pregnant, having sex once, estimated from this very complex data set. Very difficult study to do. They tried doing it where they recruited all these couples and said, you're only allowed to have sex once a month. And it didn't work. They didn't, these are young couples, active, things. A large dropout from that study. So what they had to do was allow people to have sex, but they had to record when they did it, what it was relative to the time of day of ovulation for a woman, which is here, and then they used a mathematical model to estimate these chances. So there's a peak fecundity 2 days before ovulation. That's the peak time of getting sex. Getting pregnant, about 50%, half and half for younger women. And that varies a lot from couple to couple as well. For some, it's up to 80-90% chance of getting pregnant from sex once. And others a lot lower. And of course, some people with zero, sadly, particularly if they wanted children. It doesn't drop as much as you might think for older women. A lot of nonsense talked about the low fertility of women in their late 30s because they're misusing historical data, which I could talk about if people are interested in. The point is it drops off quite sharply. On average, it's about 1 in 20, about 5 over the whole cycle. So if you can imagine having sex once at a random time, if you can imagine such a thing, I believe such things do happen. And 1 in 20 chance of getting pregnant on average for a young woman. So be warned. Unless you want to get pregnant, of course. So the point is that if you have if you're home on leave or you've just been demobbed, and you have lots of sex, and you're having lots of sex here, sex, you likely conceive here In other words, you're likely to be pregnant before you get to this time. So the time of conception moves to the left if you have a lot of sex. This is the time of conception if you just have sex once at random throughout the month. If you have it earlier, it's going to move sideways. And there's other data that suggests that if you conceive earlier in the cycle, it's very slightly more likely to be a boy. For reasons that are unexplained, really. Very slightly more likely. So there's the hypothesis. The hypothesis is that soldiers are, at the end of wars, home on leave or demobbed. They're just back together with their partners and everything. A lot of, we know from these statistics, a huge amount of unprotected sex. We think there might be a lot of it going on with these young couples, and that increases the chance of a boy. And similarly, in 1973, that was when there was a lot of unprotected sex of young couples, in a rather frantic way. Again, more boys being born. So that's the theory that I like. Not everyone agrees with that. People think, because the other thing is there's this Willard hypothesis, this evolutionary hypothesis that more boys are born at the end of wars because the world needs boys. So some women can control, I suppose under the Willard hypothesis, women can control their fertility to the extent of popping out boys when boys are needed. I don't believe it. Anyway. So, but the other side of this is that if this means these peaks, that means there's a lot of sex going on. What's going on here? This is an absolutely systematic reduction in the number of boys being born throughout the whole second half of, whole of the Victorian period. So by this hypothesis, if that means lots of sex going on, this means very little sex going on. So the argument that this is, I think, indirect evidence for supporting the theory, the abstinence or the continence theory for the reason for the fertility transition in Britain. That this was essentially people not having sex. They weren't actually not having sex at all, they were just not having sex very much. And of course there was a huge amount of propaganda, for continence, once a month, quite enough, etc., etc. So that was, there's a lot of propaganda for that. And this suggests the idea that the babies that were being born due to sort of very infrequent sex. So that's the theory which I propose and which I think is quite interesting. But it just shows how difficult it is to actually get any reliable evidence on these things at all, and one's left with a certain amount of, shall we say, hypothesizing. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks very much. Oh.